Greetings everyone, it is Zakhele and welcome back to the channel. It has been a while since I've been on your screen, so I hope that you did not miss me too much. And we are back this week talking about our Liberty First project. If you remember the last video I did, I was talking about a paper that was written by Martin van Staden on property rights and specifically on expropriation without compensation and how we can have restitution without necessarily having redistribution, right? And today we're talking about another paper that was written by associate of the FMF, Dr. Monet Malan, and this paper is expanding on the previous paper that he wrote as part of this very same Liberty First project, whereby he was talking about international trade. The name of the paper that he recently released a couple of months back, I think, if not last month, if you are watching this in September, would be Troubled Waters, Rescuing South Africa from a Tariff Disaster. And as I said, that the paper is about really international trade. Why specifically protectionism and why protectionism is horrible for the South African economy. Now, of course, if you are a regular watcher of the channel, you would know that we are opposed as liberals or libertarians to protectionism in general. I would think that even people who aren't libertarians would be opposed to protectionism given the consequences and the logic that they operate under, right? Protectionism really, as a brief descriptor, is when a state decides to artificially increase the prices of goods or services that its citizens buy from another jurisdiction. Really, that is the core explanation. We can try and get fancy about it as much as we like, but what it comes down to is a tax imposed by a state on its citizens who choose to buy certain products or goods that are not made domestically in that particular jurisdiction that is imposing those taxes, right? They have many names. You can call them customs, duties, or actual taxation, but really what it does come down to is an artificial increase in the price of something for some stated objective, right? Usually it is for, the protection of national sovereignty, it is to raise tax revenue, or it is to, project some form of, geopolitical strength, that being part of protecting political sovereignty, or it is to boost local industries. That's the boosting of local industries is the most, famous example of it. And if you look at the South African context recently, right, we had new regulations regarding packages under a certain weight that came from China that really made them much more expensive in an attempt, and the rationale for that was that they were boosting local industry. But protectionism is that. Protectionism is an attempt, in most cases, an actual reality whereby the state makes things much more expensive for you. If you're a South African and your state decides that it wants to protect the South African automotive industry as it currently does, then it means that protectionism will mean that any car that you import from any other jurisdiction that is not South Africa will be hit with heavy taxes with the end goal of trying to dissuade you from acting in a particular way or another. So really, in general, that is protectionism. And then, of course, as we know, historically, this has been argued against, and Dr. Malan makes this point in his paper as part of his introduction, whereby he mentions the historical case against protectionism, and it's something that economic science actually, as a field, was founded on. If you look back, it was founded against arguing against that sort of thinking. And when we look at the actual results of relative free trade, relative freer trade that we have had in other periods of history, we see the innumerable benefits that it does have, right? We, in the current, I guess we can now say in the past era, right, since the United States has decided to embrace protectionism, but in the past era when the United States and other global leaders in terms of the size of their economies were still proponents of free trade, we saw just the sheer good prosperity that brought to the world, right? Former countries in places like Asia and South America that were considered developing nations in the 20th century are currently considered tigers with increasing income levels for their people and an eradication of poverty. I guess the greatest one being, the Chinese example. Socialist as they are, their embrace of free trade, and they are being allowed to be part of the World Trade Organization and having relatively freer trade than they did under past regimes like the Mao regime, for instance, shows us the benefits of free trade. And of course, the logic behind, protectionism is pretty much a logic that promotes injustice. It's a logic that says that the state can decide what its citizens buy and not buy. The state should dictate which industries thrive and not thrive. And the state has no business deciding all of this on behalf of all of us. So really, that is the basic context. Protectionism, I consider it to be really the most short-sighted of things, right? Considering the economic realities of the world, we all need trade, and trade is better when it is freer. It makes everyone richer. Trying to find fault in this, to me, seems a bit short-sighted. But in Dr. Malan's paper, he makes the case that I've just made against protectionism, and the historical case thereof. And then he makes a point of showing how the impact of this protectionist attitude that we also do have in South Africa. I would say that every country does have, it just depends on a certain degree. We are now seeing an extreme far end of the spectrum in terms of protectionism. And in South Africa, the effects of this, right, at the FMF, we are in collaboration with the Fraser Institute, released something called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And as part of South Africa's increased protectionist stance in terms of imposing taxes and duties on certain products that come from other jurisdictions in an attempt to protect the South African economy, as they would say, is that we have lost our ranking, right? In 2002, in the Economic Freedom of the World Index, we used to have a rating of 7.57. And in 2022, 10 years later, we now have a rating of 6.96. And of course, right, that means that our economic freedom has decreased I guess for the purposes of our video, due to the imposition of things like sanctions and tariffs and the capital controls that we have inherited from the apartheid state, as just, a few examples. And of course, a myriad of other factors, our labor laws, everything that is covered, of course, in the Liberty First project, right? But limiting ourselves to trade, right? Our standing in the Economic Freedom of the World Index has decreased, and this has led to our economic growth simply stalling for decades on end. As Dr. Malan says here, that the economic toll is quite dire, right? GDP per capita has averaged 1% since 2008 for South Africa. And our population growth, just population growth alone, has not averaged 1% since 2008, meaning we have a population that is, or at least the growth of our population is outstripping our growth levels economically. And beyond the population numbers, really, our growth levels are not something to write home about, given the relative size of our economy, how comparable economies are performing in comparison to us. And really, in this context, we can drill this down to it being caused by this stance, this understanding of economic trade at state level as being a win and lose game, when we all know that trade, even at the most basic Robinson Crusoe level, is a win-win situation, right? Or else why would people trade? And I've already touched this on the self-defeating nature of tariffs. I mentioned how tariffs are really motivated by three main points, and these are points that Dr. Malan makes mention of in his paper, right? The three main motivations behind tariffs, those being to project geopolitical strength or for some geopolitical reasons, right? And then another being the protection of local industry. And then the last one being the raising of tax revenue. Of course, as I said, customs, duties, and any form of tariff is paid by the people in that particular jurisdiction. And as such, if the state wants to raise revenues, it can just impose tariffs on a particular product. But Dr. Malan makes an ingenious point in showing how the pursuit of one of these goals necessarily means not pursuing any other goal. Not only that, the pursuit of the goals themselves tends to be self-defeating, because taking tax revenue as an example, right? We all know if you want to raise more taxes on something, you want people to buy more of whatever it is you are trying to raise taxes for. So if the state is trying to raise tax revenue from imports through imposing tariffs on them, it makes them expensive. By making them expensive, less people buy them. And the net effect is that the state will raise less revenue from those particular imports by trying to raise more revenue through the imposition of protectionist measures. The best way to raise revenue from protectionist measures is to decrease tariffs so that people buy more of the products that do have those taxes on them, and then that will have the net effect of raising more revenue for the state. So the logic in itself is self-defeating, right? Same way in trying to protect local industries whilst maybe you are trying to raise tax revenue or trying to project geopolitical strength whilst also you're trying to protect local industries, right? Dr. Mole Malan and I, recommend anyone to go and read the paper whose link will be down below. Really makes a good case in showing how the pursuit of these ideals in and of themselves really is very self-defeating because they are contradictory, right? To pursue one, you have to let go of the other, and even within themselves, you cannot pursue them fully without necessarily sacrificing the logic that you say you are trying to get at. And I only use, the example of tax revenue. Of course, this is applicable to the geopolitical strength aspect and also the protection of local industry aspects. But the thing that we are here for the most really, right, is the solutions that are given in the paper and the solutions to solving our international trade malaise, right? These high tariffs that we have on certain products for the protection, for instance, of our local industry or for the raising of tax revenue is that, well, one of the solutions, which is an immediate action, right? And I hope that you'll be able to see this, is that we can repeal all tariffs imposed since 2019, excluding those addressing legitimate national security concerns. So that is just one, immediate, just repeal all tariffs that were passed since 2019. This is something that the state can do immediately, and it can have an immediate economic impact. It can also institute a 5-year sunset clause on all existing tariffs requiring a parliamentary vote for renewal. And I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Not only do you repeal the tariffs that have been passed over the past couple of years, you also put a moratorium on any new tariffs being increased, right? Or any new tariffs being passed. And that also will help in creating the stable environment for traders, for international exporters and importers to know that at the very least I can plan for, 3 to 4 years, invest, build a warehouse or anything like that, knowing that there's stability in the tariff rate and I won't be hit with any new tariff should my industry decide to be profitable in a couple of years. And then we also should have structural reforms that are recommended in the paper. And one of those is, abolishing the International Trade Administration Commission, replacing it with an independent body mandated to lower, not to raise trade barriers. This is pretty self-explanatory. We don't need, I am, pretty biased in this regard. I don't think that government agencies that are meant to regulate trade will ever produce the results of having free trade. So I think that by nature, they are, they will always argue for higher tariffs. But if they do exist, then they should operate on sound economic principles, wanting to make things cheaper for South Africans. South Africans don't have money, and I don't get the logic of wanting to increase tariffs. So institutions like ITAC should be scrapped, or rather their entire way of functioning be relooked, right? Another structural reform is legislate a presumption of free trade, prohibiting discrimination in trade policy except by parliamentary approval. This is pretty self-explanatory. The presumption is that free trade is the norm, and if there is any area of trade or any article that is not regulated, that is not covered by a tariff, then it means that the norm should apply. The norm should be that it's free trade. Instead of looking for an imposition of new regulations as a means to formalize that form of trade, let's just rather let people trade freely. Wouldn't that be great? But yeah, this is something that will have to be structural, of course. Streamline customs with digital systems, as in Singapore, to cut compliance costs. This really has to do with the more practical elements of trade, right? Countries like Singapore that have high ranking in, indexes like the economic freedom of the world, especially in international trade, have much more simpler compliance systems in terms of their customs unions. You can do things digitally, and they are probably much more responsive than the South African state. And as such, the South African state can learn from those countries that conduct a high deal of international trade in how they can streamline their processes, and in this instance, digitalize them and make compliance much more easier, right? As a lawyer, of course, it is self-defeating for me. Compliance gets lawyers paid a whole lot of money. But if it is much more easier in the broader sense of having a much more healthier economy in the long term, I think that is much more preferable instead of the invoices my lawyer brothers will be getting. And then another structural reform would be abolish discriminatory licensing and quotas for exports as well as imports. This is self-explanatory. Really, businesses should be allowed to trade without any imposition of quotas or any attempt for the state to put its, social engineering on them. If a business If someone wants to buy from a business that is all white owned, let them buy from that business. If it's all black owned, if it's all Indian owned, if it's all colored owned, everyone is free to buy from whomever they want and constitute their businesses however they want. Unfortunately, our South African state is not a big believer in that idea. Another structural reform is liberalize capital controls to attract FDI. I mentioned this prior, that we still have capital controls that are pretty archaic, that were instituted by the apartheid government in their attempts to stop capital from moving away from South Africa, because, the apartheid government was also pretty statist and as such, not a very nice place for capital to be in. And we still have these capital controls under, a new dispensation, and these capital controls are unattractive to foreign direct investment, because I don't want to put my money in a place where it will be harder to get it out. So let us just really make it easier for people to get their money out. That will make it that much more attractive for them to want to put their money in our economy. And then we also can have legislative interventions that the paper makes mention of. And one of those is enshrining an economic liberty and trade openness as constitutional principles, recognizing the freedom to exchange as a basic human right. Now, this is something I'm pretty passionate about, right? The South African Constitution does have a right to trade. That is not the most well fleshed out, and it is not as explicit as it could be. And such, I'm a huge supporter of this recommendation of, actually legislating and putting in constitutional text the basic human rights to trade, to freely trade, because, every other right is contingent on the assumption that people have been trading, have been generating incomes for it to be taxed. Every other social right, that is, right? Social rights are contingent on government taxation. And as such, it would not hurt if we can outline social rights. We should also outline the things that makes the social rights possible, meaning outlining the right to trade freely with as minimal interference from the state as is possible. I think this will have, in the long term, a much more positive influence on the South African economy beyond the international trade arena that we are talking about here, but in the general field, in the general economy. It will help us grow, it will help create jobs, and hopefully take us out of this road of serfdom into one of prosperity. But that was a not so brief explainer on Dr. Malan's video. I hope though you enjoyed it, even though it's on a bit of a longer side. I enjoyed talking to you about it. It's one of the papers that I have enjoyed the most in our Liberty First series. Please do tell me your thoughts. Do you agree? Do you think we should liberalize trade? Do you think we should continue with the things that we have been doing, how we have been doing them? Tell me your thoughts. Maybe you are a fan of protectionism. Maybe you think what President Trump and everyone who is a great supporter of protectionism is doing, maybe you support it. Tell me your thoughts down below. Give the video a like, subscribe if you're unsubscribed. Go and check out Dr. Malan's paper on the link posted down below. The Liberty First link will also be posted down below. There you can check out every publication that we have ever published under the Liberty First project. I'm sure that you're going to learn a lot, and hopefully a member of the South African government will read that and also want to implement some of our solutions. But yeah, tell me your thoughts, have a great time, and always remember, stay free.